Okay, so this is a little bit different to my usual paranormal. This is actually dark history. Well, it's all true, even the paranormal stuff, but this is documented dark history. I've been given permission to talk about this from Andrew McLeod. Thank you for giving me permission, Andrew. So first, before I go into this, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, especially the land that I currently live on, which is Yuin country. It always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And I would also like to point out that I will be mentioning people who are now deceased and names of people who are now deceased. Okay, so this is actually in regards to a highly documented letter that is in the Mitchell Library, known as the Glenfeild Farm Letter. And it was written by Charles Thornsby, who was a surgeon, magistrate and explorer. He actually arrived in Australia on the Coromandel, I had to make sure that I got that right, in 1802, and he was actually a very rare species of Englishman who expressed his concern and his sadness over the mistreatment of the Aboriginal people. That's why this letter is so significant in the history of the Illawarra and the Shoalhaven. He mentions names of individual people and what he witnessed, these travesties that he witnessed. And this letter was actually addressed to someone who was quite important at the time. He was one of Governor Macquarie's sidekicks. Okay, so I've actually got the facts here, so I get it completely right. Okay, so I'm sticking to facts. None of this is paranormal speculation. This is all highly documented, and anyone who, is skeptical can go and research it themselves. I would also like to point out that I myself am not Aboriginal, so there's no secret agenda here for me to reveal this. This is the truth, and it's what I feel needs to come out. There are so many places in the Shoalhaven that I have experienced overwhelming feelings of what's happened there. So that's what's pushing me to do this. So, like I said, very rare Englishman that actually considered the Aboriginal people equal to himself and demanded that they receive the respect that he received. So he actually wrote to colonial authorities seeking blankets for the Aboriginal people because in his logic he actually thought that that was really, really important. He also was very well known and not liked for intervening in cases where there was a very clear mistreatment and misuse of law, white law. Okay, so he actually turned up and he put his hand up and declared that these people were innocent when they were. Okay, and a lot of the time, if they had actually done something, it was provoked. Okay, like they were provoked. Okay, it was a retaliation from something previous that had happened. And all this is mentioned in this letter. So it's really important for everyone to go and read this letter, the whole letter. Yeah, he actually mentioned it in a newspaper in the Sydney Organ in 1827 on pages 68 and 69. Okay, so in the newspaper as well. So you can also research that. You can look that up yourself. So the letter that I'm actually talking about, which is at the Mitchell Library, is one of the earliest colonial letters. Okay, so it's from Dr Charles Thornsby, as I said, addressed to Darcy Wentworth, who was a very well-known figure at the time. He was sidekick to the man who orchestrated the war against the Aboriginal people. Okay, so Darcy Wentworth was actually the chief of police, and he was on the management committee of the Native Institute for the Education of Indigenous Children. The letter was actually written in the midst of the very well-known conflict over the land, okay, which started 28 years after the arrival of the First Fleet. So he actually describes a great atrocity committed against an Aboriginal woman and 3 of her children, okay, and in it, this is an appeal for these people to recognise the barbarity of their countrymen against the Aboriginal people, okay, and it's actually quite tragic when you read it because it's falling on deaf ears, and he was quite heartbroken by it. One of very few good men. So a very well-known figure, Broger, who is actually immortalised by the creek in Kangaroo Valley, which is named after him. He's well known for killing a cedar gatherer named John Rivet, very fairly too, who there was a very, very long history of mistreatment and abuse between these two parties, and these cedar gatherers were pirates. They came in and they destroyed ecosystems and sacred trees. So, despite the sympathy that was expressed by Thornsby, Broger was still unfairly committed of the crime, and he was hung for the crime in 1830 at Campbelltown, which really, really saddened Thornsby, and he wrote about this in his letter. Now, Broger's brother, Thothrowit, was actually one of Dr Thornsby's greatest guides, who guided him down the Mossvale area pass down to Jervis Bay in 1818, and then he later worked for Alexander Berry on Coolangatta Estate for almost 2 decades. There was one reason why he ended up there, which I'm going to go into. Because Thornsby actually really, really respected his guides and considered them an important part, he couldn't have survived without them, and he knew it. So he actually gave them, he didn't know any better, so he gave them white roles, you know, you're a constable and you're this and that, because in his logic he thought that that was a way to show how much he respected them. So that is exactly what he did. Yes, his guide ended up going and working for Alexander Berry. And in a letter to Alexander Berry from Thornsby, he actually expresses his desire for Alexander Berry to offer a place of refuge for the Aboriginal people on their mountain. Okay, so he understood that they should have been there. It should have actually been theirs. Okay, and because Alexander Berry had set up shop there, he was writing to him, you know, like, do the right thing and let them be there. So that his intentions were actually good, but Alexander Berry was an asshole. So yes, it was actually, unfortunately, it was Dr Thornsby who introduced Thothrowit to Alexander Berry. Alexander Berry is a very, very well-known historical figure. He was a surgeon and he was obsessed with human skulls, studying human skulls. Unfortunately, Dr Thornsby could not live with all of the atrocities that had happened, and the fact that he couldn't actually stop anything from happening, even with his high status and everything, he couldn't stop anything. He was found with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and he was dead. So his beloved guide, Thothrowit, went to work for Alexander Berry. That's how he went there. Alexander Berry, not a good guy from what we can read about him in history, especially what's been revealed in the last few years. So he is known to have exhumed human remains, notably the warrior Illawarra, and sent his skull back to Edinburgh University. So I don't think that him allowing Thothrowit to create the safe haven at Coolangatta Mountain was purely out of good faith. He had access to the bones that he could then exhume. So Shoalhaven has some really dark history, and that is just seriously scratching the surface. So, with permission, I will do more. So, yeah, it's important for us to actually know what has happened here. Yeah.